I thought danger had a face I could read. After years of watching people for a living, you learn to see the small tells. The way someone avoids eye contact when they lie, the rhythm of a phone buzz that means trouble, the sound a shoe makes that tells you whether someone's running or sneaking. Then I walked up a muddy path and found a man living in the woods with a mannequin that looked like my friend. That changed everything I believed about how close menace can be and why the work we do, licensed, fake, or improvised, can become the very instrument of fear. Before I dive into the stories, a quick word about who I am, not to boast, but so you understand where these tales come from. I worked as a freelance private investigator for years, not the glamorous kind on TV. None of that trench coat drama. Mostly quiet hours spent watching taillights, dialing numbers, and listening. I trailed cheating partners, verified backgrounds, and occasionally helped people find missing things that mattered to them. Lost dogs, secrets, the kind of small traumas most people don't want to admit to anyone else. The camera on a laptop or a note in a margin became as familiar to me as breathing. This isn't Hollywood. It's quieter and sometimes much darker. If you like true, unsettling stories like this, hit subscribe. I'll be sharing more. Now let me tell you the first one, how a handshake and a check turned into an obsession that smelled of mildew and gasoline. Sue was brilliant and unassuming the way some people are. Brains and a laugh, the kind of person other people underestimated until they saw the results. She'd built a small design company from a couple of client referrals and a stubborn streak. She met Steve at a networking event. He was generous with money and compliments. He showed up at product launches and laughed at jokes that weren't that funny. There had been a short, messy flirtation years before that neither of them pursued seriously. Indefinido why, whether fear or timing. But when he reappeared, he framed himself as an investor rather than a suitor. That made sense to Sue. She took the money. What happens after that is a story I've seen in different forms a dozen times. Gratitude that ripens into obligation, and obligation that curdles into control. He bought into the business, or at least he bought a stake in her attention. Calls about deadlines turned into calls about who she was with. Questions about meetings became questions about who she had dinner with. When she tried to set boundaries, they were met with confusion and then with anger that always seemed to flare and then cool, leaving her apologizing to herself for tolerating it. There are details I'm careful about because they matter to how people get hurt. I won't recite a timeline of every text, every late-night knock. What's important is the pattern, the escalation. Harassment by phone multiplied into unannounced appearances. A truck she didn't recognize idling near her building at odd hours. The first time she found her door unlocked, she chalked it up to herself being forgetful. The second time, she changed her locks. The third time, she started sleeping with a light on. The first major turning point came not in a dramatic fight, but in a bruise. A mark on her arm after she refused to meet him one evening. It wasn't bloodless theater. It was real. And it made the room smell like lemon cleaner and rubbing alcohol, because that's what you spray on surfaces when you try not to look at damage. She didn't call the cops then. She told herself there would be time to make a decision. Time is a dangerous word in those situations. Sometimes it buys you distance. Sometimes it lets a problem crystallize into something worse. Steve vanished after a few years. Vanished is the right word. No phone, no visiting, no polite emails. Sue thought that was the end. She threw herself into her work and tried to repay him whenever she could, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of a desire to close that chapter. People want clean endings. Real life rarely provides them. Years later, late at night, there was a different kind of knock at Sue's door. It was soft and impossible to ignore. Sue called me because she knew my line of work. She said someone she feared, was back in town. Maybe I should have refused. Maybe I should have handed it off to local police and kept my distance. But you don't work long in this field without being pulled in by the smell of someone else's fear. There's a stubborn, ugly part of me that can't ignore a phone that trembles with terror. I agreed to watch for a few nights. I didn't go in as a hero. I went in as a man with old instincts. We put out a little stake like you might put bait out for a raccoon. Only this bait was me sitting in a rental car, engine off, breath steaming in the cold, cigarette smoke from decades ago still in my lungs, even though I don't smoke anymore. The neighborhood was the kind that held its breath at night. Rows of houses with curtains closed, the occasional porch light a halo in a block of dark. I watched for any vehicle I recognized, any face that might not belong. The car that pulled up looked like a relic. A red pickup with dents, a cap on the back, as if someone had driven it straight out of a forgotten decade and into a field of obsession. I watched the silhouette through binoculars, small, hunched in a hoodie. After a while he moved along the row of houses, pausing at a few doorways that weren't hers, then retreating into the trees. The pattern of his movement didn't fit the profile of a casual passerby. This was deliberate. We trailed him, not too close, not too obvious. There's a rhythm to surveillance. Stay close enough for the story to hold together, far enough that you're not the story. He vanished into the woods bordering a municipal lot. We had suspected this for a while. Rumors told of someone living rough among the trees, a person who had been seen with odd, rehearsed compassion before. What I didn't expect was what I found once we pushed into that part of the woods. The path was narrow, trampled, and smelled of wet leaves and rot. There is a particular smell to places where people have been living for a long time in makeshift conditions. A mixture of mildew, diesel, and the sweet, sour rot of old food. It fills the air and seems to stick to your tongue. We followed the tracks to a low shed tucked under thinning pines, the kind of structure people build when they don't have the right to build, but the need to hide. It looked small from outside, but when we cracked the door, the air that came out was thick and old. What my eyes registered before my brain processed it was shape and form. There, propped in the very center of the shed, was a wheelchair. Not for mobility, it was a platform. Seated in that chair was a figure that at first glance might be dismissed as clutter or some wrecked prop. It was a mannequin, but not one you'd find at a department store. It had been altered, repaired, dressed and positioned with a precision that made my skin crawl. Someone had attempted to make it look like Sue. There are ways our minds try to protect us from shock, like a shutter that clicks into place a moment before you see something you wish you hadn't. My head catalogued things mechanically. The mannequin's hair was matted, a scarf wrapped around its neck. One eye had been crudely painted. There was a photograph tucked into its chest. Someone had cut the photo out of a frame and fixed it there so the mannequin was clutching it. The image in the photograph was of Sue and Steve together at some event years before, smiling, arms around each other. The whole scene had the obsessive logic of someone trying to stop time by freezing a moment and forcing the present to match it. The smell hit me then in earnest. Damp fabric, old adhesive, something chemical. I took a breath I immediately regretted. You learn quickly not to touch things in places like that. It's not just about crime scene contamination. It's about respect for what you're stepping into. The mannequin bore marks of being manipulated. Torn clothing, scuffs, something that suggested whoever had put it there had been trying to keep it upright for a long time. We called the police. When they arrived, they approached with the same caution we've all learned watching too many things go wrong. Slow movements, hands visible, voices low and clipped. The officers processed the scene. I stood outside the shed in the cold and watched the mechanical business of containment. Later, I would learn that the man we'd followed, Steve, was living in those woods in a structure he'd pieced together. He was arrested nearby, sitting on an overturned cooler, blinking into the headlights like a man whose world had been narrowed to that one, maintained image. What happened afterward, legal outcomes, the precise motivations, had gaps. People asked whether he intended to hurt Sue, We never learned a definitive answer to that. Motive, indefinido. What the arrest did do was create physical distance and a piece of official record. It was the sort of thing that looks decisive on paper, but doesn't stitch up the hole in someone's life where fear used to be. The aftermath for Sue wasn't a neat rescue. There was a trial, some things were said in court, but courtroom language cannot capture nights spent jumping at the tilt of a curtain, the sudden awareness of a car idling too long across the street, the way a laugh that used to sound like light now has an echo that tips her into anxiety. She continued to run her company. She wrote me notes of thanks that read like someone learning how to breathe again, short clipped sentences that carefully avoided discussing the image of that mannequin. People asked if she felt safe. She said, safer than before. And that was the only honest measure she had. For me, that case stayed with me because of the way the apparatus of investigation had intersected with obsession. Steve had been someone who moved in and out of conventional life, appearing respectable enough to be an investor, reappearing in the margins of someone's nights, until his private life became an object lesson in how devotion can curdle into possession. The private investigator in that scenario was not the villain or the savior. The PI was the catalyst that brought the secret out into the open. The arrest happened because someone with skills and patience followed a trail. The horror was not cinematic, but domestic and intimate, and it taught me that the tools we use, observation, patience, secrecy, are morally neutral until someone uses them for something darker. If you think that was the worst thing I ever saw, wait. I made mistakes. Everyone in that story made mistakes. We rationalize small erosions of privacy until they're too big to repair. There's a dangerous humility in hindsight. I should have seen it earlier. But hindsight is a poor sentinel against surprise. The world keeps catching people who think they can manage danger with a smile and a handshake. A week after Sue's case settled into whatever shape it was going to take, I did something I hadn't done in years. I let myself be convinced. We're all flawed. You don't spend a life looking at other people's secrets without an ache that sometimes asks you to use your skills on your own behalf. I was insecure about a relationship I was in at the time, a foolish human thing, and a friend suggested a fix from the margins. He told me about someone who claimed to offer background checks and discreet verification for cash off the books, someone who posted services in places where the desperate and the private sometimes meet. Craigslist. I know what you're thinking. And yes, me, someone with the experience I have, still let curiosity and a little wounded pride push me into a mistake. That's the truth. The line between professional distance and personal involvement is thinner than we tell ourselves. I reached out. The meeting place was a park bench, the kind of bench that's anonymous, chipped paint, a small plaque with a name I didn't read because I was already playing the role. The man who arrived, Shane, had the casual informality of someone who wanted you to feel like you could trust him before you'd even formed a clear thought. He wore a cheap jacket, and he smelled faintly of tobacco and something like oil. He introduced Gabby as someone who helps me with admin, though she looked more like someone out of place, too polished for that corner of the park. From the first minute, the red flags were textbook. The meeting was off the record, they insisted. Cash only, they said. They asked about things that didn't seem necessary, details about my apartment I hadn't volunteered, the name of the person I was worried about, where I worked. Not invasive in a way that made me bolt. Invasive in a way that felt like a friend recalling random facts about you. They seemed to know more than they should. They seemed to need that knowledge. I remember the moment I felt the plain cold of being manipulated, not to call it a crime, because at that moment what they were doing was nothing but a service they said they could provide. They offered a price and an assurance. We can get you answers. They had a way of framing everything as a simple transaction. That transaction felt like redemption at the time. Pay the money, get back the clarity, salvage the relationship, avoid the shame of confronting my partner myself. I shouldn't have gone. We all tell ourselves we have reasons, explanations. I had pride, the ache of doubt, and the habit of thinking problems are fixable if you have the right person in the right seat. Shane's method, what he said he would do, was vague. He promised discreet checks and off-hours verification. He sent a confirmation text that night. "We'll be ready tonight. Be available." Then silence. The kind that stretches isn't the polite quiet of waiting. It's the kind that expands until you have room for the worst-case scenario imagination. Days went by. He didn't call. The payment had been made in cash. There was no trace. My messages were met with the turning wheel of someone pretending to think. I tried to rationalize it away. Maybe he's busy. Maybe he dropped his phone. But the more I waited, the more the feeling of being made small settled on me. And then the message came. It was short, stripped of charm. A late-night text that said, "Come to 2nd and Hollow now, we're in the basement." It included a pin, but the pin meant nothing to me when I realized it led to an old industrial building that everyone in town knew used to be a factory before it was abandoned and left to moss and pigeons. I had a sinking feeling in my gut, a professional instinct that something did not add up. The way the message used the word "we" implied others, which either meant backup or a setup. I could have ignored it. I told myself I would ignore it. But there's a human weakness that intersects with being a man who lived in observation for a living. You sometimes think your presence in a scene will make you less of a target. You think you have the tools to untangle what someone else has knotted up. And the truth, hard as it is to say, was I wanted answers. I wanted to look at the people I'd trusted and judge them defeated. Pride, curiosity, a dash of professional arrogance, they make a potent cocktail. I walked to the place alone, phone pressed against my palm like a talisman. The building looked like it had given up on being a building years ago. Broken windows, patched with plywood, graffiti curling like a warning. The air around it smelled of rust and dust and old paint. There was an uneasy stillness, the kind you notice when a place that should have life is holding its breath. There was one light on inside, a dim bulb that hummed like a trapped insect. The door gave under my weight with a sound that announced my trespass to the empty walls. I texted my partner where I was, an old habit I never lost, though I told them something bland and quick enough to sound normal. "Going for a walk. Be right back." I thought it would sound like nothing, and it did, until it didn't. The interior smelled colder, a concrete taste that sucked into the back of my throat. The stairs leading to the basement were metal and thin, groaning softly underfoot. Each footfall echoed. At the bottom of the stairs, the light was weaker. It threw shadows like hands, long and reaching. My thumb hovered over the phone, ready to call or run or do something. There was a small door, half ajar, and a sliver of light leaking out like someone trying not to be seen. My heart hit a tempo I hadn't felt in a long time, not the patient pulse of surveillance, but the rapid, panicked rhythm of being the subject of something I hadn't arranged. The phone buzzed again, another text from Shane. "Down, doors open. We didn't expect you to be brave." The phrase was meant to be comforting. It did the opposite. The argument you have with your gut in these seconds is swift and fierce. You're trained to read patterns. You know when a setup is likely, but you also remember the last time you were wrong, and you don't want to be wrong again. It is a peculiar form of denial, fueled by self-reproach and the hope that you are the author of your own narrative. I stood with my hand on the cold metal of the banister, listening to the building breathe around me, and I felt the old, sticky knowledge of what people will do when the safest-looking solution is the one they choose to take. They'll assume they're in control. They won't imagine that the person offering help might be setting a trap. I was about to step inside when the bulb flickered and a smell hit me. Damp, something like the interior of a refrigerator that's been left unplugged. The sound of the front door closing upstairs made my shoulders twinge with a fear that was suddenly very physical. Footfalls disappeared. There was no sound of voices now. The silence pushed in. I told myself one last practical thing. Remember escape routes. Don't tie your hands with decisions. The truth is, in that moment of training, meeting instinct, meeting regret, the next step is never entirely rational. You act with a mix of past lessons and present adrenaline. I took one step forward and then another, the stair metal biting my shoe soles, and the light from the half-open door painted a strip of the basement across my face. The room smelled older and more closed in than the stairwell. Something about the way the shadows sat told me I wasn't expected to come down alone. Someone had been ready for my arrival. And then my phone went dead. Not off, not just quiet. The screen went black as if a hand had reached into my pocket and closed a lid over the little window to the world. The battery icon had been fine a minute before. I thumbed the side of the phone until my fingers ached, but it remained dark. Panic is strange. It has a flavor to it, metallic, like pennies in your mouth. I reached for the light switch on the wall, fingertips grazing dust. The bulb hummed and then steadied. I almost laughed, a thin, brittle sound that didn't reach my throat. Ridiculous, I thought, technical glitch or something more deliberate. Either way, I was in the belly of an abandoned building with two people who had access to the place and to me. I realized with a clarity that felt like cold water that this wasn't about a job anymore. It had become about who had the power to shape my next few minutes. At that precise moment, the basement door creaked fully open. A figure filled the doorway, backlit, and for a second all I could see was a silhouette. The instincts that had kept me alive through 1,000 nights of watching made my steps rehearse their exit before my legs moved. My hand found a crate, and my fingers dug into splintering wood. The person in the doorway stepped in. Gabby's voice, somehow small and ordinary, said, "We didn't think you'd actually come down, Detective." Everything in me, profession, pride, survival, tensed. And that is where this part of the story stops, because what followed matters, and it's a story you deserve to hear in full, not as a clipped anecdote. I will tell you what happened next in a bit, but before I do, I need you to understand why this moment is the kind of pivot that makes a person question how much of life is choice and how much is circumstance. There are patterns criminals use, and there are patterns people fall into. The Craigslist trap succeeded because it mixed credibility with intimacy. Shane and Gabby spoke in a language my ego recognized: professionalism without credentials, opportunity without paperwork. It was a con that used my own habits, my tendency to observe and to think I could control, to make me step into a situation where I was vulnerable. Shane's motive? Indefinido. Gabby's role? Indefinido. Whether they meant to harm me, extort me, or simply vanish with the cash, those are facts I didn't have then. You learn after nights like that your mistakes are not always the kind you'll forgive. Some of them stay in your mouth. Some of them teach you painfully how to be less naive. You also learn that the line between investigator and target is thinner than you want to imagine. One breath can cross it. I want to be clear here. I'm not telling you this to make myself look brave or foolish. I'm telling you this because these are the kinds of ordinary choices that turned into horror stories for people I cared about and for me. The first case, Sue and Steve, was a lesson in how affection can become possession, and how the tools we use to watch can be a way to expose danger, but also to keep it alive. The second case, the Craigslist trap, was a lesson in humility. The professional who thinks he is immune to simple schemes is often the easiest mark. If you're still with me, you'll get the rest of that evening, the narrowness of the choices I had left, and what it felt like to be on the cusp of being hurt because I wanted answers. And after that, the third story is one that will complicate everything you think you know about private investigators, about as much as the first two did. In that one, A licensed investigator's report would tip the scale between abduction and survival, and it would show me that sometimes the Watcher is the only thing standing between you and a very bad fate. But that's for later. For now, imagine the basement door's edge catching the light, the shape in the doorway watching you, and a voice that sounds like a regular person saying your name as if it owns you. Imagine you have 1 second to decide whether to trust what you see. That's where I was. The rest matters, and it's not something I want to rush through. Everything after that silhouette and Gabby's casual voice happened in a rush that replayed in my head for months like a scratched record. For a second, my training and my fear collided, and neither offered a perfect answer. The room smelled of dust and old sweat. The air felt too small, as if it could be folded closed, and you would be left outside, shivering. I didn't try to be a hero. I didn't charge or accost. I did what surveillance had taught me when the narrative flipped and I became the thing being watched. Look for the least expected exit, make a small noise that makes people reveal themselves, and, if possible, get to daylight. I moved like someone who belonged there. An old trick. I pretended to fumble with my phone as if to call someone, thumbing the side until my hand looked natural. I took 1 step back, then another, pretending the staircase felt steeper than it was. When Gabby took 2 steps into the room and said my name again, this time with a clipped warmth, I let a half-laugh escape my lips and said, "You know my phone's gone dead. I guess it's on its last legs." It sounded flippant because I wanted it to. I wanted it to sound like a joke somebody made when things felt uncomfortable. Her face shifted, milliseconds you don't usually get in real life, but which flesh and bone still give you when their script is interrupted. For a heartbeat, I thought I might be wrong about everything, that they'd been only odd and sleazy and not dangerous. Then something in Gabby's eyes tightened the way a fist tightens when someone decides whether to throw a punch. My feet were already moving. I stepped backward up the stairs. The metal groaned under me. The sound was a small, betraying drumbeat. Shane's voice came from somewhere behind Gabby, muffled. Maybe a cough meant to cover the fact he was signaling, maybe just habit. For a brief, awful flash, I imagined hands, a struggle, the sort of thing you see in movies that feels oddly uncinematic in the moment because real fear doesn't have a soundtrack. I reached the top of the stairs and pushed the door with more force than it deserved. It opened. The factory smelled like history, like a place time had quit. I ran. I ran because the choice between staying and leaving was suddenly a blurless one. My sneakers slapped on cracked concrete, and I headed for the nearest exit that took me away from that door and into the sodium-orange glow of the streetlights. I didn't look back. I learned later that the texts, those precise timed messages, were the kind of bait used to get someone into an enclosed space alone. Whether Shane and Gabby planned to do more than take my money, or whether they intended to scare me for sport, or whether they had another purpose, indefinido, I never saw them again after that night. I didn't call the police right away. I don't have a proud explanation for that. I had a shameful one. I told myself that because I hadn't been physically hurt, because I had escaped, it would be harder to convince anyone I wasn't making mountains of molehills. Also, there was embarrassment, the peculiar sting of a man who'd made his life observing being fooled by a con that relied on the exact habits he used to make his living. The weeks after felt like living under a low, constant thunder. I found myself checking locks more often than seemed rational. I learned to notice cars in my rear view longer than necessary. The address I had written down for the Craigslist meeting, an old industrial block, seemed to haunt me when I crossed near it. Sometimes I would find myself late at night tracing the route I had taken out of the building, not because I expected to find them hiding in an alley, but because ritual can feel safer than randomness. I moved my furniture a handful of times, less because anyone could find me, and more because changing the shape of a room makes memories step through the doorway and trip over a new couch. I told a couple of close friends. I didn't file an official report until months later, and even then it was patchy. names missing, details blurred by time and shame. That's not advice, it's confession. People in my line of work are not immune to the small, corrosive things that make victims hesitate. The mistake of that night taught me a lesson that bled into everything else I did afterward. Insecurity opens doors, not only to other people, but to outcomes you never wanted. Time, which had once been my ally, stitched the wound only in shape, not in feeling. I stopped answering messages from numbers I didn't recognize. I started sleeping with the blinds open in case I needed to see someone's face before they got to the house. Paranoia is unspectacular. It is small adjustments you make that feel less ridiculous after a while because they've kept you from regretting things. If you think the worst part of the Craigslist episode is the near miss in the basement, then you haven't met Wade. The third story is where the lines between watcher and protector blur so completely they frighten you. This one begins with a pandemic and a decision to move cities, with that particular kind of human need to remake yourself when everything else felt flimsy. Apps were how people dated then. A scroll, a curated smile, and you tried to find something like a connection among the noise. I matched with Wade on one of those nights when the apartment felt too quiet. He was handsome, in a bland, designed way. Tall, dark hair combed in that slick, old-fashioned manner. A jaw that looked like it had been practiced in a mirror. Our first dates were ordinary in the best sense. Coffee, things to laugh about, a shared dislike of small talk dressed as conversation. He asked how my work fit into my life. I deflected with an old PI reflex, giving enough to feel human, but not so much to invite prying. Then the small things started. A car we'd never seen before parked on my block for long stretches. Dark grey SUV, tinted windows. I told myself 1,000 reasonable things, maybe a neighbour's guest, maybe a delivery van. When I saw the vehicle more often than not, even when Wade couldn't have reason to be nearby, the hairs on the back of my neck rose. Once walking a different route home, I noticed someone across the street who looked like he was standing too still to be a passerby. He had the posture of someone waiting to see if a pattern would repeat. I called a friend for advice. They told me about precautions. I told them about the SUV. They told me not to breathe into fear. But the device on the edge of my worry whispered a different truth. The person you date who seems too present can also be someone who wants to own your time, your places, your exits. One day, about a month after we started seeing each other, Wade's conversation took a turn. He grew insistent about knowing where I lived. He asked questions not casually but pointedly. "What's your morning routine like? Do you leave at 8 or 9? He framed it as wanting to coordinate weekends, to not intrude. At first, I thought he was considerate. Later, that same consideration read like planning. 2 weeks later, when I noticed him staring a bit too long during a crowded brunch, I excused myself. On my walk home, the grey SUV was waiting at the corner with the engine off. He stepped out. Not Wade. A man with a badge, clipped, thin, inconspicuous, approached. I braced myself because my history had taught me to expect the worst. Either someone who wanted to frighten me, or someone who had been paid to watch me. This is where a line you don't expect shows up. The man approaching me wasn't who I'd feared. He introduced himself as a licensed private investigator. He wasn't boorish or dramatic. He was quiet and aware in a way that made you feel both seen and unnerved. He didn't tell me who had hired him at first. He simply said, "Ma'am, I've been asked to keep an eye on you." He had a folder, a small one, and he tapped it like a man who kept things tidy for a living. I asked him outright, "By whom?" He gave me a look that suggested he'd hoped I wasn't going to ask, but he answered all the same. "Indefinido," he said. That's literally what he told me, not as a word to make me feel better, but as an admission that the client wanted to stay anonymous. He explained he had reported what he saw to local officers because he'd been concerned about the frequency and the manner of one man's appearances. He called Wade's pattern unsettling and said it warranted a closer look. He said more, but what landed on me was this. Someone licensed to follow people had flagged the behavior as risky. It is a strange feeling to have someone on your side who is, by trade, part of the reason you feel watched. But this PI wasn't there to hurt me. He was there because someone, Investigator, who had paid him to check a pattern. He had flagged Wade. He had alerted the police. He had concerns. Those things mattered when a person you were seeing changed from an ordinary partner to someone whose presence felt like a calculation. One evening, a week later, the thin line between a watch and a threat snapped. I took a walk through a patch of woods near my apartment because I liked the hollow of that route. It felt private and steady. The light was failing. Leaves were a smudge of color. I thought of nothing dramatic. I thought of a podcast I'd been listening to. Then a rustle. Then a presence. Wade stepped out of the trees in a hurry, like someone who had rehearsed an exit and decided to improvise. He walked toward me with an intensity I had never interpreted as romance. His hand closed on my arm. He spoke quickly, words I don't remember in full, because my body had shifted into a mode before my mind could fill in the facts. Something in his face had bent away from reason. He tried to steer me toward a path where there was no one to see us, toward his car. His voice had that odd mix of coercion and pleading that people use when they believe affection gives them ownership. The world narrows in moments like that. You feel the ground, the weight of your chest, the cadence of your breath. I remember thinking, rational or not, that this felt like an attempt to take control, an attempt that could lead anywhere. And then Paul appeared. Paul was someone I'd seen on and off in the months before. We weren't serious. He was quiet and steady, and crucially in that moment, nearby. He had been walking his dog and had crossed the path at the wrong time and the right time. He saw Wade's hand on my arm. He saw the look on Wade's face. Paul didn't hesitate. He moved like someone who had never trained for that exact moment, but who knew instinctively what needed to be done. He pulled Wade off me and shoved him back. He tackled him in a way that was loud, clumsy, and perfect. Wade struggled. The SUV's driver door slammed. The whole thing was messy, human. And then police arrived. Someone had called 911. And sirens turned the woods into a scene that looked more like a movie than the real, raw, panicked moments it had been. The licensed PI we'd met earlier showed up too. He had been watching, either because he'd been paid to follow Wade or because he'd been following my pattern and had seen Wade's movements intersect with mine. He had been the one to flag things. He stayed back and told the officers what he had observed, the SUV's habitual presence, the way Wade had started to appear at places without cause, his insistence that suggested escalation. The PI's report was not a panacea, but it was a paper trail. It gave the officers something tangible to put in a file, and for the first time since I had started to feel watched, there was someone whose professional note could corroborate my fears. Wade wasn't arrested that night in a way that ended the story neatly. The police took statements. There was a commotion. He argued. He left with a bruise on his ego and a bunch of questions about what comes next. In the end, the outcome I remember as most concrete was legal. We obtained a restraining order. The PI's observations and the officer reports helped make a case that authorities could act on. Wade vanished not long after. Whether he relocated, told himself he'd lost, or went quiet for other reasons. Indefinido. What mattered was the order, the official boundary that said, in words and on paper, that he could not come near me. The aftermath of that moment was layered. There was fear, yes, but there was also a kind of gratitude that sat like a cool bandage over something raw. The licensed PI, who had been paid by someone I never fully knew to watch, had played a protective role. He had not been the predator from the Craigslist story. He had been the thing that kept the predator from crossing the threshold. That complexity is exactly the point. Private investigators are not a monolith. They are tools, people who can be used for harm, or people who can be a line of defense. In my 3 stories, the PI role morphed. In Sue's case, the investigative tools exposed an obsession and brought a man out of hiding. In my Craigslist story, people selling PI services were either con artists or worse. In the Wade episode, a licensed professional's observations helped avert something that could have been catastrophic. Survivorship didn't feel like a tidy arc. After the police files closed and the restraining order was in place, my life kept going with a kind of new architecture. Alarms, a support network who understood more than I expected, therapy sessions that peeled back rationalizations until I could see where I had been naive and where others had been wrong. There were nights I still flinched at the sound of a truck idling. There were mornings I checked the back seat of my car before settling in. Those are practical things and emotional things folded together. What I learned, what all of these stories taught me, painfully and plainly, is this. Danger doesn't always look how we imagine it. It often wears a smile that reads as warmth until it doesn't. It can be transacted like a check hidden behind a job title, disguised in goodwill. The title of this video isn't melodramatic. These are shocking real-life private investigator horror stories you won't believe. You might not believe them because they don't look cinematic. They look like meetings, like contracts, like dates, like knocks at the door. They are ordinary gestures twisted into instruments of control. There are a few threads that braid through all of it. First, trust is both a social lubricant and a risk. Saying I trusted them is not an admission of weakness, it's a human fact. Second, the institutions and roles we rely on, investigators, police, paper orders, can help. But they are not absolute bulwarks against fear. They can thin its edges or give you a piece of paper saying someone must stay away. They can also be absent when we most need them. Third, the person you hire or the person who hires someone to watch you can become the source of your undoing or your rescue. There is no simple mapping of titles to moral value. If you take anything from these stories, I want it to be this: trust your instincts. If a meeting feels wrong, it probably is. If someone who claims to be a professional seems off, cash only, evasive about identity, respect that feeling. That said, don't let fear alone be your guide. Find allies. Tell someone your plans. Use official channels when you can. I'm not giving legal advice. I'm saying what worked imperfectly in my life. Sometimes the watcher is the worst thing. Sometimes the watcher is what keeps you breathing when things go wrong. The only thing I can promise is that the world is complicated in that way. The PI who hid a mannequin and the PI who wrote a quiet, careful report were using the same skill set but toward different ends. You don't fully recover from these things. You learn to live alongside them. You learn to set boundaries both in places and in people. You keep your eyes open, not as a way of living in terror, but of choosing more carefully who you let close. If these stories landed on you the way they did for me, cold and a little raw, then you're not alone. The comments on videos like this are where people trade the small, lonely horrors that don't make the news and the ways they've started to heal. If you've ever felt watched, or if one of these stories stirred something you've lived through, share the outlines in the comments. Keep it nameless if you want. Keep it full if you need to. We learn in those margins. If you want more stories like this, true, unsettling, and told from the vantage of someone who spent a life watching, subscribe. If this resonated, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you ever find yourself unsure whether a knock or a message is routine or something to fear, trust that sensation. You don't have to have all the answers in the moment. You can ask for help. You can step back. You can, if you must, call someone and say the words that matter. I feel like I'm being watched. These were 3 PI-related nightmares: an obsession exposed in a shed, a ransom of trust in a basement, and a near abduction ended by intervention. They are all linked by the simple fact that tools intended for protection can be misused, and people who appear benign can be anything but. Keep your phone charged, keep your friends close, and keep your instincts honest. Have you ever felt watched? Share your story below, anonymous if you prefer. If this video helped you make sense of something, like and subscribe for more. Above all, be safe.